This, after all, is our annual Barbara Herman lecture. But this year, it is not precisely a lecture, but a full symposium. It's entitled Ancient Nubia, New Ideas, New Discoveries. And I know you will not be disappointed. The order of our speakers approximately follows the order of the exhibition. So first, we'll have Dr. Stuart Tyson Smith, Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Institute for Social, Behavioral, and Economic Research at UC Santa Barbara. His talk is entitled Egyptological Bias, Intercultural Interactions and Entanglement. Next comes Dr. Kathryn Howley, the Lila Acheson Wallace Assistant Professor of Ancient Egyptian Art and Archaeology at the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. And the title of her lecture is Looking Beyond the Surface, the Use of Egyptian Motifs by Nubian Royalty in the Nafferton Period. We'll continue then with Dr. Jeremy Pope, Associate Professor of Art History at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. And he will speak to us today. His lecture is entitled Nubian Queen, How an Ancient African Kingdom Became a Symbol of Feminine Power. Our last speaker, Dr. Pawel Wolf, joins us from the German Archaeological Institute in Berlin. And he will speak to us about the surprising extent of the Meroitic heartland and its suburbs. The title of his lecture is Urbanity in Ancient Nubia. So without further ado, I'd like to have our first speaker come up and again, welcome you all.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks very much to Rita and the organizers for pulling the symposium together. I hope you enjoy it. It's a great lineup. So Egyptologists have tended for a long time to view Nubia, and still to some extent today, I'm sorry to say, to view Nubia through the lens of Egypt rather than as a civilization on its own part. Nubia becomes kind of an appendage of Egypt. Anything good in Nubia is due to Egyptian direct influence. And even figures like this gentleman here, Bianchi, one of the founding figures of the 25th dynasty, who secured control over all of Egypt and started off this vibrant civilization, we'll hear more from Kathryn about, is often sort of thought of as just the result of Egyptian influence and even not that sophisticated. And I'll just give you one quote from John Wilson, a very sort of classic Egyptologist writing in the 1950s. He reflects this attitude of Nubian inferiority when describing the Kushite dynasty, and I quote, "The story of Bianchi's conquest of Egypt is an extraordinarily interesting human development, particularly in the contrast between this backwater Puritan and the effete and sophisticated Egyptians." He goes on to say that, and I quote, "Thus Egypt fell under the nominal rule of an Ethiopian from the despised provinces, and under the effectual rule of a woman," and he's talking about the god's wife of Amun, Amenirtis, based at Thebes. So managing to be both rather racist and sexist at the same time, which Egyptologists have a certain talent for. But in fact, what I'm proposing here is that we shift our viewpoint from Egypt looking kind of down at Nubia, and this is partly a projection of Egyptian ideology, partly a projection of modern notions of racism, also coming from a kind of colonial narrative of African inferiority. And instead, shift our viewpoint the other direction, and instead of looking at Nubia as produced by Egyptian influence, rather look at the dynamic nature of intercultural interaction, and particularly this idea of cultural entanglement that I'll explore further, using some examples from our recent research at the ancient Egyptian colonial site of Tombos, and also a Kerma site that I'll talk about first and go into right now. Now, while I'm talking about bad Egyptologists, I'll introduce George Andrew Reisner. If you've seen the exhibit, he was a brilliant archaeologist. And if any of you saw Elizabeth Miner's talk just recently, you'll know how his excavations can be mined for really interesting information about the dynamics of Kushite civilization. But his conclusions were, in fact, horribly racist. Again, argues that the superior Egyptian bloodlines of an Egyptian colony at Kerma were diluted by intermarriage with the local Nubian women. So again, managing to be both racist and sexist at the same time. And he's taking his cue, of course, from ancient Egyptian ideology, which showed Nubians as inferior, as chaotic, as the classic enemy of Egypt. Egyptologists sometimes hold this up as, well, the Egyptians had a negative view of Egypt, so when, of Nubia rather. So when Bianchi came and took over Egypt, he must have been viewed as this kind of outsider, and that's very much John Wilson's argument. But in fact, this overlooks the kind of long history of interaction between the two civilizations and the fact that this is ideology. This is basically propaganda. But also, the Middle Eastern peoples were treated in exactly the same way as Nubians. No less civilized, every bit as chaotic, every bit as the stereotypical enemy as were the other archetypical enemy, Libyans, that's kind of surrounded, a sort of sea of chaos surrounding an inner Egyptian order. So for Reisner, taking this perspective, anything good in Nubia had to be the result of Egyptianization, another model that we see commonly used when looking at Nubia. And for him, that meant some kind of assimilation. And then once the Egyptian influence faded away, then you see Nubia goes into a decline until the next cycle of Egyptianization or Egyptian influence. So for him, he argued that Kerma must be an Egyptian colony. And I'm sorry to say this sometimes crops up in secondary sources still today because they're looking at older sources where this was really an entrenched idea up until the latter half of the 20th century when people started seriously pushing back against it. He also saw the New Kingdom Empire as a kind of civilizing influence, and again, that went into a decline to rise again with the Kushite pharaohs, who initially, he argued, were actually Libyans, not Nubians. I don't think anybody actually believed that, though. But then later on argued for, again, another round of Egyptian influence. And these kind of tropes have been repeated over and over again. Now, without the extreme of calling Kerma an Egyptian colony, Egyptologists have still often thought of Kerma as somehow Egyptianizing. And this is a very strange notion, and we can see it from Reisner's perspective. He saw, you see a view of the cemetery at Kerma. I'm standing on top of the massive mortuary temple overlooking the last of the great royal tombs. And in that tomb, of course, you will have seen it if you've seen the exhibit, are statues from Egypt of the Lady Senui and her husband. And Reisner saw the statuary and assumed, oh, well, it must be an Egyptian colony. And that was partly because the Kerma civilization was so obviously complex and grand that it couldn't have been a native African civilization. It had to have come from Egypt. And you'll note I use that terminology. That's not because I don't think that Egypt was not an African civilization. In fact, I'm firmly convinced it is. But it's often treated as if it isn't, and one still sees these sort of titles. So I think you have to look at Nubia and Egypt as two African civilizations in interaction. And so there were, to be fair, some Egyptologists who pointed out things like these massive tumuli, the practice of retainer sacrifice and so on, are all practices that are very different from Egypt. Also, all different aspects of the material culture, burial practice. I'll have some examples in just a second. Are very, very different from ancient Egypt. So Reisner's idea that it was a colony, there was some pushback against it, but by and large, people had accepted it. But instead, what we should see is the display of items like the statuary actually looted from Egypt reflects a kind of projection of esoteric knowledge and power by these Kushite rulers. So you have this civilization to the north, and by bringing in and deploying these statues, other aspects of material culture, they're showing their knowledge of distant lands and power and authority by showing how they can control the other. And this, of course, is the same thing that motivated Egyptians to depict Nubians in the ways they did, and so forth. Now, since the work of Charles Bonnet at Kerma, we know that Kerma was the center of a vibrant civilization, a true urban center, one of the earliest in Africa. And in fact, that Kerma was not just dominated by Egypt, but in fact was Egypt's rival in Northeast Africa. And we can see a huge urban center and so on. Now, when we look at architecture like the great urban Defufa, which you see here, it represents this kind of idea of entanglement. So this can involve the adoption of exotic practices or foreign practices, but more often the adaptation of those practices, imagery and so on, material culture, but also indifference and rejection. And typically it's a blending of these different elements, and it's a process of mutual influence rather than simply assimilation driven from Egypt into Nubia, as again, Egyptologists have often argued. And you can see this at Kerma, the mud brick architectural technology of building a massive structure like this was clearly borrowed from Egypt, but the monument itself is a uniquely Nubian thing. In a similar way, within the urban center, we see round structures, and that round structure was originally made of a kind of post-hole traditional architecture in Nubia, but then later more in mud brick. But we also see elements of rectilinear architecture and so on that would have been borrowed directly from Egypt. We also see things like ram imagery surrounding religion that may actually have influenced Egyptian ram imagery, connected especially with the cult of the god Amun. So it does go both ways. Similarly, here's the massive mortuary temple that I showed you from standing on top, looking at the big tomb. And here we see Egyptian imagery, like this winged uraeus deployed. And here's a good example of adaptation. So again, the technology, even the symbolism here is Egyptian, but in fact it's integrated into a fundamentally Nubian institution and within a Nubian cultural framework. We also have examples of rejection. So all the beautiful Kerma pottery that you can see on display here. This is a beautiful bowl that we found in a new excavation at a Kerma cemetery just to the south of our colonial site. Nubian ceramic traditions not only are not influenced by Egyptian ones, they deliberately, in spite of the fact they were in interaction with Egyptians, they knew about Egyptian pottery techniques like the wheel. All this pottery is handmade. They retained those traditions in spite of that contact. And even after the empire, as you'll see in a minute, they continued making these traditional style potteries with this kind of black-topped decoration. And we also see hybrids in blended pottery with blended elements, like this wonderful bowl here, which may be on display. Yeah, which is on display in the exhibit. And you can see here Aegean motifs, a kind of running knot motif, but also blended in with some Egyptian motifs, with some Levantine influences as well. So it shows that Nubian civilizations were not a kind of unsophisticated backwater, but in fact were very much engaged with the larger world of Northeast Africa as well as the Mediterranean. Now, in terms of the impacts of Egyptian influence during the Kerma era on the kind of local populations, we've begun excavation at a place called Abu Fatima, which is about 10 kilometers north of Kerma, so within the Kerma hinterland, but a relatively modest society, the people who were supporting the grand tradition. And here we see basically no real Egyptian influence. So we have flex burials. The pottery is almost all Nubian. There is one little Egyptian pot up in the upper left-hand side as an import. Could have been as much for the contents of the pot as the pot itself. But the Nubian pottery traditions definitely dominate. Features like ostrich feather fans, animal burials. We've had a couple of burials of dogs as well as sheep, and as a ceremonial component of burial. We see these things at Kerma as well. And again, the significance of sheep to Nubian civilization is something that perhaps represents that kind of two-way entanglement. Another thing that we see, again, an example of rejection, is cloth. We have some cloth, but not a lot. Instead, the real emphasis is on leatherwork, and it's amazing stuff. So we're finding entirely preserved leather skirts on bodies. I mean, they're very delicate and kind of broken up, but we can reconstruct the whole thing, and you can see examples of this incredibly detailed stitching, and especially the piece in the upper right with its perforations, incredibly small, amazingly detailed, and there's a little hem in there too. And that's 5 centimeters, so the piece is like this big. It's incredible. And this little bit of woven, kind of woven strand, amazing. So we see Nubian crafts predominating at Kerma. The notion of a Kerma Egyptianization is really can't be sustained at all. But the influence we see tends to be very strongly adaptive and often rejecting Egyptian things. So rather than Egyptian material culture being, as Barry Kemp said, kind of overwhelming the sort of folksy Nubian culture with its fancy mass-produced objects and a kind of parallel to modern globalism, in fact, we see Nubian traditions are very durable. Now, the Kerma civilization lasted for around 1,000 years, but came to an end with the Egyptian conquest in about 1500 BC, which forged empires both in the Levant and throughout an extensive area in Nubia. And I'll mention a site called Askut very briefly, but my main examples will come from Tombos. And that cemetery of Abu Fatima that I just showed you is just right to the south of Tombos, again, just a little bit north of Kerma. And the fact that Tombos was located at the third cataract of the Nile, kind of on a boundary where we see heavy Egyptian influence with these colonial communities founded throughout the region. But south of Kerma, we don't really, south of the third cataract, rather, we don't really see a lot of evidence for full-on colonization. It seems that this was an important kind of internal boundary within the Egyptian empire. So again, an interesting locus to look at intercultural interaction in this process of entanglement. It also seems to have been a symbolic boundary. So we have a series of stelae. As I said, the fortress itself was established around 1450 BC, and we just recently established that it probably represents a place called Taroi that's mentioned in an Egyptian text from about the time of Amenhotep III, around 1350 BC. So our main work, though, and what I'll focus on for examples here, is within the cemetery. So the cemetery has two parts. One is a more kind of Egyptian part, if you will, with pyramid tombs and Egyptian-style superstructures, but still a bit of entanglement going on. But then, very interestingly, before the end of the New Kingdom, with what Egyptologists call the Ramesside period, starting around 1200 BC, we see a Nubian cemetery with Nubian-style tumulus mounds on top of graves. Although, again, with an increasing pace of entanglement and increasing sophistication of entanglement over time. Now, within the Egyptian part of the cemetery, we know, and I don't have time to really go into it here, but we know from isotopic analyses as well as craniofacial measurements that what we have is a population of Egyptian colonists who then intermarried with, or I can't really 100% say they were married, but interbred, to use not too fine a term, with the colonists, and we end up having a mixed population, and so we have both biological and cultural entanglements. The Egyptian colonists brought the full suite of Egyptian practices with them. So, for example, we have evidence for mummification, and not just ordinary mummification, but with a set of canopic jars that we recently found, this one dedicated to a priest named Happy. Coincidentally, this particular jar is also dedicated to, or invokes the protection of the son of Horus, whose name is also Happy, but a different Happy. So a lot of happiness going on with this guy. But we actually, the sad, shriveled remains of the person's internal organs were actually still in this, so we do know that they were practicing full evisceration. We have also found things like Ushabti figurines and heart scarabs. And the most freakish thing, I have to say, that we've ever found in Tombos is this. It's a human skull, fragment of a human skull, with writing on it. And initially I thought, okay, this is weird. Something strange is going on here. And here you can see from infrared a little more detail. But I think what's happened is a papyrus has transferred, the ink from a papyrus is transferred onto the skull after the tomb was looted. And so this is probably a copy of the Book of the Dead, although I still haven't had a chance to verify that. Otherwise, we see typical Egyptian burial practice. You notice this is the bottom part of a woman, and her legs are pinned together, and that would indicate wrapping consistent with mummification. But most of the time, the flesh, wrappings, Coffins even aren't very well preserved because wood is not very well preserved. This is a common problem in Nubia more generally. But here we found things like cosmetic equipment, very common. I love this little dish, which if you look at the left-hand side of it, you'll see there's a little beak and a little head, and it's got a little tail, so it's a little ducky dish. It's very cute. And earrings, other kinds of jewelry. That scarab, interestingly enough, actually dates from the Middle Kingdom. And it could have been looted from a tomb in the northern part of Nubia where there was a colonization episode, or even from Kush itself where we find these Middle Kingdom scarabs. But I really think it's most likely an heirloom. So again, if these were colonists coming from Egypt, they were bringing treasured items with them that might eventually make their way into tombs. And the pottery is predominantly Egyptian. This is the cutest pot we found to continue our duck theme. A little incense burner dating from the Ramesside period, the later part of the cemetery, and was actually found at the bottom of a shaft of the tomb, right in the entrance. I love that kind of thing. You can imagine the people, in the funeral, and they're burning incense to help the deceased go through the afterlife. And other things, so we see a layout of a tomb here. So burial practice, head towards the west, facing towards the eastern horizon, to benefit from the rejuvenating powers of the sun, who's reborn every morning at dawn, and pottery, scarabs, amulets, other things. But you notice right in the middle of the shaft, there is a flex burial, so in the traditional Nubian style. And that's why we found about 10 flexed burials of all of women. So there's a gender dynamic to this sort of entanglement. And this definitely represents an example of this kind of cultural entanglement. And here you see another one of these burials, a woman in a flex position that's very reminiscent of burials at Kerma itself. And she was found in association with the amulets. Actually, that's a single amulet, the two sides of it on the left, with the god Khepri, the ray born on the horizon, and then the god Nefertum below. And then another burial was found with these two wonderful little amulets of the god Bes. And Bes becomes an extremely popular deity in Nubia, taken up by the Nubians with great enthusiasm. We also see Nubian pottery showing up, again, in spite of the fact that Egyptologists have often posited that Nubian traditions disappeared under these layers of Egyptian colonialism and this idea of assimilation. In fact, we find Nubian pottery, a cooking pot on the left, a nice bowl, not quite as nice as the height of Nubian civilization, but nevertheless. And we also see Nubian cooking vessels at sites like Askut, and I don't have time to go into it, a fortress that was built in the Middle Kingdom, still occupied in the New Kingdom. And you can see the brown or orangey brown lines are all Egyptian pottery. You can see most of the ceramic assemblage is heavily dominated by Egyptian pots, serving vessels like cups and jars. But the cooking vessels are dominated by Nubian cooking vessels. So we see a kind of Nubian takeover in the household related to cuisine. Now, just as the Kerma civilization came to an end, the Egyptian empire also came to an end with a rebellion of the last viceroy of Kush named Panhesi, who split the colony away and then ushered in what Egyptologists refer to as a dark age, but I think that's only because there aren't a lot of texts, which I guess is sort of the definition of an dark age. But it doesn't mean that not anything was going on. And we have this inscription of Queen Katamala suggests some kind of successor state. And that's what, the newer archaeology looking at this transition are finding lots and lots of continuities, and not this notion of a kind of return to barbarism that eventually ushered in individuals. This is the Nubian pharaoh Taharqa. Through a second wave of Egyptianization, we don't really need to posit that Egyptian influence, but rather we can see this as, at least in part, due to these continuing cultural entanglements. So here's Reisner again, and of course he argued that, in fact, these Nubian dynasts were, had sort of returned to barbarism, and then were actually Libyan kings to start with, and so on. But this idea of the Nubian colony sort of splintered apart into these small chiefdoms, is usually the term used, which again is kind of cued to colonial era language about Africa. after an Egyptian withdrawal. In fact, there was no Egyptian withdrawal. The colony split away, and we see this at places like Amara West, Tombos, and various other sites. We see continuity across that divide. And what we see following this is a lot of entanglement and adaptation, and I won't go into this. Kathryn's going to be talking more about the royal side of things, but this is how a Kushite king represented himself as opposed to the sort of illustrations even from National Geographic that show Nubians, let me just go back one second, that show Nubians very much in the trope of the enemy that opposes Egypt from the New Kingdom rather than on their own terms that you see here. So at Tombos, so what I'd like to do is look at how this plays out at a more secondary level with a broader population at Tombos. So we see the continuing construction of pyramids. This pyramid here overbuilds the ruin of New Kingdom tombs, so I think it may date to the Third Intermediate Period, which would be very exciting. But we're going back this season, and hopefully we'll be able to pin down the date a little bit better. But it's definitely very, very late, maybe 25th dynasty, like this pyramid here. And it's important to remember that monumental forms and symbolism like pyramids, at some point during their life in Nubia, and there were dozens and dozens of pyramids built in Nubia before the 25th dynasty, they become internalized. They become not an Egyptian thing, but really a Nubian kind of monument. And so instead of looking to Egyptian pyramids as the inspiration for Nubian pyramids, I think you need to look at these local monuments, the monuments of the Egyptian and eventually entangled. Many of these people were of Nubian ancestry who were important bureaucrats within the colonial apparatus. And the point that there's no reason to think that this colonial apparatus simply disappeared. And at Tombos, we have a lot of hints of practices that we see later on in the 25th dynasty that represent these kind of complex adaptations and entanglements. So we have this amazing horse burial, beautifully done, kind of echoing the horse burials or presaging the horse burials at El Kuru, with a bit of iron, with very early piece of iron from about 900 BC, and then even a little bit of jewelry that makes you think of the elaborate tack that we find in the burials at Kuru. And the pace of entanglement just increases. So amongst the tumuli, we see Nubian practices, like the tubular structures themselves, bed burials, and blacktop pottery. But still Egyptian amulets and scarabs and things. The scarab is quite interesting because it looks as if it doesn't have any good parallels, so it looks as if it might have been a local product. And, oops, all right, it's not going to do that, is it? No, it's not. Okay, so I'll just go through these slides very quickly because I'm running out of time. I apologize. So one of these burials, again, burials show this combination of things. So we have a mummified burial in the remains of a coffin on top of a bed, but with blacktop pottery. So we see these complex sets of entanglements. But again, unlike that notion that the Nubians were sort of a backwater empire, we see iron weaponry, but juxtaposed with lithic tip weaponry, and we see these from the royal tombs as well as other places. Imagery like this bull with cattle on it that's very reminiscent of the bull from right here, but fits into what's been referred to as the international style of the Iron Age. So you can see these kind of bull imagery and an elaborately decorated wooden box with images, and I'll help you out here, of a cow licking a calf, and in front of that a benu bird, a stork. So in this kind of a swampy motif, it's kind of a papyrus swamp. Here's an ivory from Nimrud that shows you exactly the same motif. So it's about rebirth and with a heavy sort of overlay of cow symbolism. Another example of the god Nefertum again, but with the cows on either side, quite unique, but also tying into the international style. So here from Assyria, from exactly the same time frame, images of Nefertum, but in this case flanked by deities. And then finally, inside of the box, we found this amazing set of vessels. This one made of faience. This one is absolutely unique, and I think must be a local product because it doesn't really find any close parallels. But this one is a sort of pièce de résistance, this beautiful little Bes vessel, again, that god Bes being very influential, and this little frog lid, quite remarkable. And again, we see this is tapping into a kind of international style, both in the Levant with these examples, including in monumental form. But it's all best was other dwarf deities like Patekos were something that tied Nubia itself together. Oops, I'll go back just very briefly. There we go. So we can see these kind of amulets spread around in both royal and non-royal contexts up and down Nubia. And there's that little beautiful Patekos that was found, very much like the ones from the Royal Cemetery. And just to finish, so Nubia, far from being a backwater, was actually a full participant, and I think actually generating objects in this style new to themselves, a fully cosmopolitan civilization representing these different kinds of cultural entanglement, but coming up with new objects, new material culture, new theologies, playing off of Egyptian ideas. So the frog amulet, this little frog lid, there's actually a parallel all the way across the Mediterranean and Sardinia. The bowls with cattle imagery surround the Mediterranean, found quite widespread. Another little object I didn't talk about, but a little scarab with a cryptographic inscription that was common throughout the Mediterranean world, but in fact is a very innovative variant and very sophisticated variant on this. So Nubians brought a new level of sophistication to their intertwining and adaptation of Egyptian material culture coming out of the colonial encounter, but also the long history of interaction. And then here, a few acknowledgments for all our supporters and my co-directors, especially Michelle Bouzon and Sarah Schrader. Thank you very much.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. I've been asked to speak to you today about the Nafferton Period and the fascinating use of Egyptian motifs by the Nubian kings. First of all, a quick introduction for those not familiar with the period. In the first millennium BC, after millennia of enduring repeated military incursions and colonial occupation by the Egyptians, the Nubians, we might say, got their revenge in approximately 720 BC. King Bianchi led an invading force that swept through Egypt. This is the stela in which he recounts his heroic exploits. Unfortunately, as you can see at the top, he's been rather chipped out, so I actually have exactly the same picture as Stuart just showed you, which is a rather more lively representation of events. Now, Bianchi and his descendants, often called in Egyptology the 25th dynasty, ruled over Egypt for the next century. Their successors, even after being forced out of Egypt by pressures from the Assyrians, maintained the cultural coherency of the dynasty, who are known as the Nafferton Kings, after the city of Nafta, their political and religious center located near the fourth cataract of the Nile. The Nafferton period is traditionally considered to last until approximately 300 BC, when the capital of the Nubian kings moved south from Nafta to Meroe. Today, I will be talking about objects and buildings from the early and middle Nafferton period, approximately 750 to 580 BC, when contact between Egypt and Nubia was at its height. So, Nubia was finally militarily on top. And yet, rather than taking the opportunity to introduce Egypt to the wonders of fine pottery, tumuli, and burial beds, all traditional features associated with Nubian cultures, the Nafferton period is known instead for its Egyptianness. This has long proved a problem for Egyptologists, who have been so confused by the Nafferton king's profuse Egyptian explosion that they can't quite seem to take it seriously. Scholars have long been looking for the differences between the Nafferton-made or Nafferton-owned material and the Egyptian originals on which they were based, to see whether the Nubians made any mistakes in their copying, or indeed whether it's possible to see Nubian ethnic identity being asserted in the changes that Nubians have made to Egyptian motifs. That is, a kind of Nubianness coming through. The problem is that on a surface level, the Nafferton kings really haven't adapted the Egyptian models at all. On the sarcophagus of a spelter that you see here, that's housed here in the museum, for example, The religious texts that were being used on the sarcophagus were exactly the same as Egyptian Theban priests at the time chose for their coffins. And in fact, the versions of religious texts on the sarcophagi contain exactly the same spelling mistakes as the Egyptian versions, suggesting very strongly that they derive from a single source. We can see the same phenomenon on this Shabti of the Nafferton king Senkmenisken. Unlike his predecessor Shabtis, this one has a back pillar, as you can see right here, a feature that wasn't introduced into Egyptian Shabtis until around 650 BC. Senkmenisken, coming to power in about 640 then, is really following the latest trends in Egyptian Shabti design, straight from the workshops of Thebes. So if the Nafferton kings borrowed these Egyptian motifs so literally, what does this mean for our understanding of the Nubians' Egyptian borrowing? Must we acknowledge that scholarly interpretations of the early 20th century were correct, and that Nubians were unimaginative and awed by the great civilization of the Egyptians? Well, no. And in fact, I would argue that it would be a gross mistake to do so that would cause us to misunderstand the relationship between Nubia and Egypt at this time. The problem is, perhaps unsurprisingly, given how beautiful much of the material is, that we have been blinded by the visual and concentrated only on what these things look like. But people's culture is contained not just in their things, but also in their actions. If you'll permit me a modern parallel, if any one of you were to open my kitchen cupboards at home, you would find exactly the same ceramic vessels as in the average Americans. That is, thick-walled, handled drinking vessels with a capacity of about 12 ounces, otherwise known as mugs. Now, one might think solely from their appearance that my assimilation to American society is therefore complete. But a study of how I use the vessels would reveal that the liquid inside is tea, not coffee, that I pour milk into that tea, and that on special occasions I even dunk biscuits, not cookies, into the liquid inside. Now, such actions can also have strong emotional bonds that are difficult to reconstruct from the appearance of the objects. A Brit's answer to any emotional crisis is, after all, a nice cup of tea. So, it's these ephemeral actions and even thoughts around the objects that we will have to find in order to properly understand the Egyptian motifs in Nafferton visual culture. But then, we are leaving behind the comforting solidity of the objects that remain. Of the objects themselves, and we're literally chasing ghosts, that is, the people that moved around the objects. Now, like most ghosts, it helps to see them if you can look out of the corner of your eye. And so today I will not be looking directly at the objects, at their iconography and their forms, but at patterns in how they appear, their archaeological context, that is, where they were left and where they were found, and how they were made. I will take a series of 3 themes today to illustrate the hidden non-Egyptianness that lies behind the Egyptian motifs of Nafferton visual culture, those of practice, production, and preeminence. But I want to emphasize that by doing so, we do not find some pure Nubianness either. The Naffertons governed their territory as one land, with a presence in the 25th dynasty that stretched all the way in the south here from Nubia, all the way up to Memphis and the Mediterranean Sea. I will be talking about sites today that range from the fourth cataract of the Nile, deep in Nubia, all the way, at the fourth cataract, the Royal Cemetery of Nuri and the Temple of Amun at Sanam, all the way to Egyptian Thebes, right here. And therefore, the material culture we're going to look at is a reflection of deeply entwined traditions from a vast swathe of the Nile Valley, in which the Naffertons are reacting to their culture and circumstances and producing something new. It is not possible, and has never been, to uncover some pure idea of Nubian culture from the material of this period. It looks, and in some cases is, Egyptian, but since Nubians used it, it was at the same time Nubian, and the Egyptian motifs that were so popular in the Nafferton period came to define Nubian culture for future generations of Nubians too. The Royal Cemetery of Nuri provides the starting point for our first theme, that of practice. Nuri is a vast pyramid field containing the tombs of kings and royal women founded by King Taharqa of the 25th dynasty, but mostly in use during the Middle and Late Nafferton periods. Despite the fact that most of the kings buried here were no longer in territorial control of Egypt, we see perhaps the greatest proportion of Egyptian motifs of any Nafferton site. Here is just a selection of objects found in the burial assemblages: shabtis, foundation deposits, Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, things made of faience, and other precious stones and metals that likely came from Egypt. We've already seen how trendy some of these things were in an Egyptian sense. In appearance, then, these objects are basically entirely Egyptian, but they were found in Nubia, in use by Nubians. An investigation of practice, that is, how the Nubians used these things, reveals that the uses around the objects were significantly different to how they would have been used by an Egyptian in Egypt. That is, the object was adapted to make it meaningful in its new cultural context. Menat amulets are one illuminating example where we're able to reconstruct how the Nubians would have interacted with an Egyptian-style object. While in Egypt, these were either used as counterweights to balance out large necklaces or as votive offerings to the goddess Hathor, archaeological context demonstrates that they had a far more particular use in Nubia. Reisner's careful documentation of his excavations at Nuri allows us to see that in many tombs at Nuri, these amulets were found on the staircase down to the burial chamber, with one or two laid carefully on every step. One can imagine this to have formed part of the funerary ritual as the priest left the tomb, placing the amulets behind him before the staircase was filled in, and that they therefore had a protective rather than a votive function, even though they kept the visual feature of the stringing loop from their Egyptian function as necklaces. Shabtis offer a second example of the practices surrounding Egyptian material culture in Nafferton period Nubia. Firstly, the fine spot of the figurine helps us to inform us as to the practices surrounding the shabti. Reisner's excavation notebooks and photographs show that when shabtis were found in situ in the Middle Nafferton tombs at Nuri, they were arranged standing around the walls of the burial chamber. This extract from Reisner's diaries, every little cross represents where shabtis were standing, so they were literally lining most of the tomb. This is in contrast to Egyptian practices where shabtis at this time were often arranged neatly in boxes or just in piles on the floor of the tomb. Secondly, the number of the shabtis also separates the Nubian shabtis at Nuri from Egyptian examples. The Nubian kings especially are known for their, quite frankly, excessive number of shabtis, with Senkermaniskan owning over 1,200. Both of these examples suggest that shabtis were used with slightly different practices in Nubia than in Egypt. One can imagine, for example, that the time-consuming task of arranging the figurines standing up around the walls might have formed part of the Nubian funerary ceremony. These differing practices also may have corresponded to differing beliefs about the function of shabtis, as guards for the body perhaps, rather than servants for the afterlife. In other words, while the form of the shabtis may have travelled more or less wholesale from Egypt to Nubia, through reconstructing the behaviours of those who used the objects, we can see that the use and meaning of the Egyptian object underwent significant changes in its new environment. Our second theme looks back in time, not to the object in use, but to before it was even made. By looking at the processes that went into manufacture of Egyptian-style objects, the differing environment and priorities of the Nafferton kings become clear. For this theme, we'll go to the site of my ongoing excavations at the temple of King Taharqa at Sanam in the region of Nafferton. King Taharqa was the master builder of the Nafferton kings, building extensively throughout his territories in Egypt and Nubia. As part of his construction program, he built a network of temples dedicated to Amun throughout his Nubian territory. Though the temple at Sanam was explored over 100 years ago by the famed Oxford philologist Francis Llewellyn Griffith, he was interested, unsurprisingly for the time, in the interior of the temple, where he hoped to find text and monumental statuary. Since, as you can see, the temple, built of soft Nubian sandstone, has been quite badly damaged, he was generally rather disappointed with the results and spent only a single season there. One of the discoveries which he made, but never investigated further, were traces of production at the temple. What he was unable to realize at the time, since neither Nuri nor the other Royal Nafferton Cemetery El Kuru had yet been excavated or published, was that the Shakti Molds that he found were being used to manufacture figurines for the royal tombs. So here you can see various different Shakti Molds that Griffith found. And here's an imprint that he took from one of them. And then you can actually match some of the figurines from Nuri very closely to particular molds for the Shaktis. Now, only royal family members in the Nafferton period were permitted to own Shaktis, and Shaktis are never found in the tombs of non-royal individuals. Therefore, what Griffith dismissed as uninteresting, in fact, links the Amun temple with the burials of the Nafferton royal family in a way that is not familiar to us from Egyptian monuments. One of our priorities with the fieldwork, then, has been to identify and investigate the production areas which must have been in use at the temple. This has demonstrated that while the final appearance of the objects was Egyptian, the processes that went into making them revealed the local cultural influences that determined their manufacture and the differing functions that they would have fulfilled in a Nubian cultural environment. Now, we were able, thankfully, to identify an area of extensive production debris in our first season in 2018. To the rear of the temple, you should be able to see the hypostyle hall right here. And here is the production area where we found it, literally directly outside the walls of the temple. Now, over the past 2 seasons of work, we have made several surprising discoveries. Our most prized one, sorry, I couldn't help myself, was our very own perfectly preserved Shakti mold, into which the faience paste would have been pressed to create the fine facial details that you can see here. The object type certainly has its roots in Egypt, but here the Shaktis are clearly being made far south of Egypt in the heartland of the Nafferton kings. However, the process of making faience, a type of self-glazing ceramic, requires lime. Normally in Egypt, we assume that this came from limestone or from sand that was formed from limestone. But in Nubia, there is no limestone, only sandstone, so they needed to get their lime from somewhere else. One of the surprising finds we made in the production areas were, quite frankly, ridiculous qualities of tiny Nile mollusk shells, and I apologize now to my excavators, they had a horrible time retrieving all of these, along with large quantities of grinding stones, and also faience beads and various wasters from the faience production process, these kind of lumpy amorphous things you can see here. Now, it's quite possible that the shells were being ground up to be used as an additive for faience production, and that therefore, despite the Egyptian appearance of the objects, the process of making was marked as Nubian and quite literally embodied in the laborious collection and subsequent grinding of shells that wasn't done in Egypt. The location of these production areas is a further clue to Nubian practices that underlay Egyptian objects. They are right outside the walls of the temple. None of the surviving faience workshops from Egypt are located in a similar position, where actually they're generally found in domestic contexts, not religious ones. The production of Egyptian-style faience objects at Sanam, therefore, is quite literally physically overshadowed by the Egyptian-style temple. Why the production areas were sited here, in a place not perhaps immediately obvious as suitable for the dirty, hot work of faience production, can perhaps be understood by considering what role the Egyptian objects we see being made here had in Nubian society. The craftsmen were clearly using Nubian processes to create objects, including Shaktis, that only royal Nubians were allowed to possess. So the craftsmen are making things that, while they're not terribly monetarily valuable, they were not actually allowed to use themselves. And they're doing so while in the constant presence of monumental images of the king and a building whose access was probably heavily restricted, possibly even to the craftsmen themselves. The Egyptian objects that the Nafferton royal family used in their tombs were a way of demonstrating the king's exclusive access to such objects. And although they were eventually sealed away in the tomb, Both the production practices directly outside the Amun temple and the practices of use, highly involved processes in which the priests were arranging the Egyptian objects in the tomb as part of the funeral ritual, would have ensured that these Egyptian objects acted on a Nubian audience in the desired way. So the final theme, preeminence, demonstrates that practice doesn't have to be on the level of individual objects, but can encompass whole systems of behavior. Now, to look at this, we'll move north to Egypt, where the Nafferton kings had to come up with creative ways to rule over such a large territory and ensure that the rule was accepted by the Egyptians. While the king played a vital role here, of course, he also made use of royal women, who were placed in priestly office in Thebes to wield immense power. These women are known as the gods' wives of Amun. This title was an Egyptian office that had existed for centuries, and therefore the Nubian women were able to place themselves into a pre-existing Egyptian religious structure. But in order to leverage the position for the political and religious requirements of Nafferton Egypt, they certainly didn't behave in ways that fitted with the Egyptian history of the office. In doing so, however, they were not reproducing Nubian patterns of behavior for Nafferton royal women. Rather, the exceptional circumstances of Nafferton control over Egypt meant that the gods' wives produced something entirely remarkable for both Egypt and Nubia, and achieved a preeminence which only becomes fully visible through comparison of their visual culture with other examples from both Egypt and Nubia. The first object I want to use to illustrate this principle is the Sphinx of Shepenwepet II, holding before her a Nemset vessel. In fact, two very similar statues of her were found that were almost certainly erected in Karnak Temple in Thebes, with one being found submerged in the sacred lake, while the other one, now in Cairo, was one of the nearly 800 statues found in the Karnak cachette in front of the temple's seventh pylon. Now, the use of Sphinx iconography by a woman was rare in ancient Egypt, with only about 30 female sphinxes surviving. Those of Shepenwepet are the only ones from the late period, so she was certainly not taking any inspiration from her close contemporaries. The reason so few exist is because the Sphinx was generally a form that only kings portrayed themselves as. But if we look not only at the Sphinx form, but what she is carrying, the iconography of the statue becomes yet more striking. There are no other examples known of female sphinxes holding Nemset vessels, and indeed only 9 examples of royal male sphinxes doing so before this time. All of them date from the New Kingdom. Some of these New Kingdom sphinxes, however, were also found in the Karnak cachette, raising the intriguing possibility that Shepenwepet saw these statues in Karnak Temple and was responding directly to them. Even more striking, these earlier statues belong to Ramses II, mightiest of all the pharaohs, whose degree of building activity over his long reign was almost unparalleled. Shepenwepet then not only took the step of portraying herself, a female priestess, in a form that was normally reserved for male kings, she also did so in a way that referenced a statue of the greatest king of them all, one famed for the number of children he had produced as well as his extensive building activity. With both Ramses and Shepenwepet's statue likely on view in Karnak Temple, the message would have been clear. On a purely iconographic level, it would be hard to get more Egyptian than aping Ramses II. But here, Shepenwepet is not concerned with Egyptianness, but with advertising her unprecedented kingly power and influence in a most pointed and public way. Such statues are not the only way in which the gods' wives of Amun, and particularly Shepenwepet, assumed kingly motifs and religious roles during the Nafferton period, in a way that, while using Egyptian motifs, betrays a distinct change in cultural and religious practice to what had come before. All the gods' wives built temples, even at Karnak, an activity that had been previously restricted to kings, while Shepenwepet II even celebrated her own Sed festival, the rituals of kingly renewal. But I'd like to now point out another aspect of the gods' wives of Amun's use of kingly prerogative that echoes not Egyptian kingship, but Nubian. The gods' wives are known for their tomb chapels in front of the great Theban temple of Medinet Habu, where they were laid to rest beneath stone chapels that were elaborately decorated. These burials fit within Third Intermediate Period Egyptian traditions of burial chapels within temple enclosures, rather than the pyramid burials of their family members in the royal burial grounds in Nubia. Their burial assemblage also points to a difference between the gods' wives of Amun and other Nafferton royal women who were buried in Nubia, and in such a way that the unprecedented kingly prerogative of the god's wife is emphasized. Again, looking at Shepen-Wefet, she had large numbers of Shabti figurines of multiple types, being supplied with both stone examples and smaller faience ones. Now, the use of multiple types of Shabtis in a single tomb, and particularly the use of stone Shabtis, not faience ones, occurs only in kingly tombs in Nubia, not the tombs of royal women. A similar pattern can be seen when comparing Shepen-Wefet's monumental granite offering table with those of her family in Nubia. Such large, well-carved stone versions were much more common in kings' tombs, and importantly, there is only one other granite example known that belonged to a queen. The rest were all kings. Canopic jars were also mostly restricted to kings and queens of the very highest status, and perhaps most tellingly, Shepen-Wefet's tomb was furnished with inscribed foundation deposits. While all of the Nafferton kings buried at Nuri had such deposits, only one queen, who had the extra special distinction of being both king's wife and king's mother, was able to match Shepen-Wefet in possession of inscribed foundation tablets such as this one. In the range, quality, and materials of the tomb contents of the gods' wives, then, the assemblages resemble more closely those of the Nafferton kings than they do even the queenly tombs in Nubia, and show how Nubian norms, as much as Egyptian, were disrupted by the particular cultural circumstances of the Nafferton period. So, as I hope I've demonstrated, the use of Egyptian motifs in the Nafferton period is not a case of the Nubians seeking to straightforwardly adopt Egyptian culture. It is also not the case that by stripping away the Egyptian motifs from the visual culture of this time period, we're left with a pure, unadulterated Nubian culture by which we can somehow understand the true nature of rulers such as Taharqa. Rather, by looking somewhat askance at these very Egyptian-looking things with archaeological methodologies, we start to uncover a rich tapestry of practices which animated the objects as they were used. Practices of ritual, of production, and of preeminence. These practices demonstrate the way that Nafferton period kings and priestesses adopted Egyptian-style objects into a vibrant cultural milieu of activity that stretched at times from the sixth cataract of the Nile to the Mediterranean Sea. Such conscious and learned manipulation of Egyptian visual culture no doubt had different effects on its audience, depending on whether they were in Sanam or Memphis. But the subsuming of Egyptian motifs into Nubian cultural practice became an integral part of Nafferton royal culture, even after they no longer had control over Egypt, in which ideas such as Nubian and Egyptian can no longer be separated from each other. The objects and buildings that I've shared with you today demonstrate the strikingly mixed nature of visual culture in the Nafferton period Nile Valley, entangled, multi-dimensional, and completely enchanting. Thank you.
Across the modern history of global popular culture, the phrase Nubian queen has appeared in the lyrics of hundreds of songs. The examples that you see on this slide were sung by artists from New Jersey to Paris and from Cape Verde to Compton. Around the world, the Nubian queen has become an example of ancient history gone viral. It has been repeated like a mantra and then merchandised as a product. But why? Why is it that when popular culture invokes the idea of queenship, the adjective Nubian is so frequently attached? And conversely, why is it that when popular culture invokes ancient Nubia, the image of a queen repeatedly comes to mind? For those outside of the very specialized academic field of Nubiology, it might seem logical to assume that ancient Nubia is associated with queens simply because ancient Nubia was usually ruled by a woman. But this assumption would be mistaken. More than 70 rulers of ancient Nubia are known to historians by name, and more than 90% of them were men. If ancient Nubia was not usually ruled by a woman, then why has it become so pervasively linked to the idea of queenship in modern global popular culture? One possible answer might be that the few women who did rule Nubia alone are commemorated today precisely because they were exceptional, unique deviations from the patriarchy that otherwise defined the rest of the ancient world. However, this explanation must be confronted with the example of ancient Egypt. As Egyptologist Kara Cooney reminds us in her 2018 book, Egyptian queens repeatedly did exert supreme political power over one of the most influential states of the ancient world. Cooney even goes so far as to assert of antiquity that Egypt was the only state that consistently allowed female rule. Cooney's assertion threatens to turn our entire inquiry on its head. If, as Cooney proposes, ancient Egypt was the only state that consistently allowed female rule, then why is it instead ancient Nubia that has become pervasively linked to the idea of queenship in modern global popular culture? Is that linkage actually an error, a modern misunderstanding of ancient history? To find out, we need to go back to the early modern era. Throughout my lecture today, I will repeatedly mark this timeline across the bottom of the screen in order to help everyone follow the sequence. Centuries before any archaeologist ever put a trowel to the ground in the Nubian region of Sudan, modern awareness of ancient Nubia was heavily dependent upon translations of the Bible. And one verse in the Bible loomed particularly large. This verse in Psalm 68, "Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God." There are a few things that I want to highlight about this verse. First, the land of Nubia is called here in the King James translation by its Greek name, Ethiopia. This terminology often confuses modern audiences, but it's easily explained. The Greek term Ethiopia meant literally land of dark faces. So it was a physical description of the inhabitants of many countries known to the Greeks. But the Ethiopia best known to the Greeks was not the modern country that bears that name today on the Horn of Africa, but rather the land of Nubia, located immediately to the south of Egypt. Second, notice the gender attributed to Ethiopia in this verse. Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God. It would be tempting to dismiss this feminine possessive pronoun as nothing more than some Jacobean poetic flourish on the part of the King James translators. After all, archaic forms of the English language often treat place names as inherently feminine, with phrases like Britain and her colonies. But let's look more closely at the ancient source on which this English translation was based. The Bible as first composed in Hebrew. The Hebrew Bible refers to Nubia as Cush, and the grammatical gender of that proper noun appears to have confused the Hebrew scribe. Translated literally, the verse reads, Cush, she stretches forth his hands unto God. Did the ancient Hebrew scribe understand the place name Cush as grammatically feminine or as grammatically masculine? Did the scribe make a mistake here? And if so, which pronoun is the mistaken one? To answer this question, scholars employ a logical principle of textual criticism that is known by its Latin name, lectio difficilior. This principle holds that the more unusual phrase is more likely the original one, because scribes copying a manuscript would more often replace odd phrases with familiar ones rather than replacing familiar phrases with odd ones. Since masculine pronouns are much more common than feminine ones in the Hebrew Bible, translators have consistently concluded that the feminine pronoun was the original one, and thus that Cush was regarded as somehow feminine by the original author of Psalm 68. The King James translation reflects this understanding of the passage. So we have already some indication that the early modern linkage between ancient Nubia and feminine power apparently was consistent with at least one ancient source. However, it would take centuries before modern audiences would realize just how accurate this depiction of ancient Nubian society really was. In the meantime, this biblical verse about ancient Nubia was catapulted to exceptional prominence. The popularity of Psalm 68 in the early modern era derives partly from its translation in the future tense, as a prophecy. In the Hebrew Bible, the passage seems to have predicted that at some future moment, ancient Nubia would render either gifts or worship to the God of the Hebrews. Modern Christians, however, reinterpreted this verse about ancient Nubia as a prophecy about modern Ethiopians, that is, dark-skinned peoples of the modern world. The ancient name, Ethiopia, land of dark faces, seemed to map so easily onto modern concepts of race. Thus, the first book ever written about people of African descent in the Americas had this verse emblazoned in Latin on its cover, as a prophecy that enslaved Africans in Cartagena, Colombia, would one day accept Christianity. For enslaved peoples themselves, the verse eventually became a source of hope. In the litany of examples that I'm about to rattle off for you, notice the changing content of the prophecy and the consistent retention of the feminine pronoun. In 1774, Bostonian poetess Phyllis Wheatley interpreted Psalm 68 as a statement about the religious redemption of African-descended peoples worldwide, writing, "I hope that which the divine royal psalmist says by inspiration is now on the point of being accomplished. Namely, Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth her hands unto God." Just 2 decades later, Bostonian Prince Hall, founder of the Prince Hall Masons, wrote of the Haitian Revolution, "Thus doth Ethiopia begin to stretch forth her hand from a sink of slavery to freedom and equality." And as emancipation later approached in North America, author Francis Harper published a poem entitled Ethiopia, in which African Americans as a collective were embodied in the figure of a long-suffering woman named Ethiopia. The poem concludes with the words, "Then Ethiopia, stretch, O stretch, thy bleeding hands abroad. Thy cry of agony shall reach and find redress from God." These and many other uses of Psalm 68 cemented Nubia, biblical Ethiopia, as a symbol of aspiration across the early modern world. And their consistent use of the pronoun her in reference to Nubia simultaneously reinforced the belief that this country was somehow uniquely feminine. It is perhaps worth reminding ourselves at this point that all of these modern sentiments were invoking an ancient passage, and one that, in its original ancient context, was specifically about Nubia. This fact is easy to forget because early modern audiences between the 1620s and the 1850s had access to very little information about the ancient state upon which that biblical verse had been based. Harper's Ethiopia stretches out her hands abroad, but the poem focuses more on the pronoun her than on the adverb abroad, more on the femininity of Ethiopia than on its geographical location. Evidence about ancient Nubia would, however, soon be forthcoming. During the same years when Harper was composing her poem, the Prussian Egyptologist Richard Lepsius was conducting one of the first epigraphic surveys of ancient Nubia. The relief scenes that he copied featured numerous ancient Nubian women, sometimes occupying pride of place in the scene, either in front of men and closest to the god, or executing the traditional duties of the supreme ruler, such as smiting the country's enemies. This representation of women would have been unusual in ancient Egypt, but Lepsius found it repeatedly in Nubia. Many of these scenes dated from the 1st century AD, and Lepsius was quick to connect them to a passage in the New Testament book of Acts referring to Candace, queen of the Ethiopians. But the prominent representation of Nubian women was not confined to the 1st century AD. Other examples discovered by Egyptologists during the mid-19th century revealed a similar pattern, and many of these dated to much earlier periods of Nubian history. The scene that you see here derives from the early 6th century BC, and the figure shown at far right is a Nubian queen whose direct speech to the gods is inscribed in hieroglyphs immediately in front of her. In the inscription below this scene, the king of Nubia justifies his right to rule by listing off 7 generations of his female ancestors. Perhaps most intriguing was the fact that similar depictions of women increased in Egypt during precisely the era when the Nubians annexed Egypt in the 8th and 7th centuries BC as its 25th dynasty. Notice the woman here who stands in front of her husband in a manner seldom attested upon Egyptian monuments. The woman in question is actually Egyptian, but she appears here as a subject of the new Nubian dynasty, so the gender conventions employed were presumably those favored by the Nubians. The hieroglyphic inscription below this scene then explains that the Nubian royal women accompanied the army during its annexation of Egypt, and that it was these Nubian women who first received the obeisance there of the conquered foes. The evidence for feminine power in ancient Nubia, discovered in the middle of the 19th century, gradually became known to the world outside of Egyptology. The American poet Walt Whitman was among those especially interested. In the Walt Whitman archive, I found this note by Whitman, in which he inquires to a colleague about those discoveries made in Ethiopia by the Egyptologist Richard Lepsius. Whitman's inquiry then gave rise to a poem entitled Ethiopia Saluting the Colors, in which a newly freed African-American woman named Ethiopia salutes the Union soldiers as they withdraw from the Confederacy after the American Civil War. The poem repeatedly describes this woman as ancient, a double entendre that positions her as both an elderly American who has lived her entire life enslaved, and simultaneously as an inheritor of a mysterious African history that fascinated Whitman. In his decision to center the poem around a woman, Walt Whitman may very well have been influenced by the long-standing tradition of representing Ethiopia as feminine. But literary scholars have also noted an additional motivation. During the Reconstruction era, America was embroiled in debates about whether to extend voting rights to African American men. Whitman effectively sidestepped this controversy by focusing his poem instead upon an African American woman. Whitman had reinforced the popular linkage between Nubia and femininity, but one of his principal reasons for doing so had absolutely nothing to do with ancient history at all. A very similar dynamic manifested just a few years later across the Atlantic. During the early 1870s, Giuseppe Verdi's Egyptomanic opera Aida premiered in Cairo and then across Europe. The scenario for the opera had been drafted by a French Egyptologist, Auguste Mariette, and Mariette included authentic details culled from ancient inscriptions recently discovered in Nubia. Most significantly, of course, the title character of the opera was a Nubian princess. Even so, Verdi's purpose was not to faithfully portray an ancient history, but instead to disguise a modern political commentary about the Italian Risorgimento. Ancient Egypt would represent the Habsburg imperialism of 19th century Austria, and ancient Nubia would represent the victim, Verdi's Italy. To this end, when the Nubian princess Aida came to center stage, the music would turn to chromatic harmonies and woodwind orchestration designed to evoke sympathy for Nubia as an allegory for Italy. As one of the most popular operas ever, performed countless times across the past century from Verdi to Elton John, Aida remains one of the most influential forces linking Nubia to femininity in modern popular culture. For many people in the modern world, the Aida character is Nubia, perhaps the only Nubia they may ever know. But the linkage thereby cemented was between Nubia and a stereotyped femininity, not yet between Nubia and feminine power. From Phyllis Wheatley to Giuseppe Verdi, Ethiopia stretching forth her hands was still viewed as a suppliant figure, pleading to power rather than wielding power herself. This characterization would begin to change during the first half of the 20th century. In 1913, progressives staged an event known as the America's Making Exposition, in which representatives of various ethnic groups would each produce an exhibit highlighting their group's aspirations and contributions to American nationalism. For the African American component of the show, the organizers recruited a famous sociologist and ardent supporter of women's suffrage, none other than Harvard man W.B. Du Bois. Du Bois chose to represent African Americans in a way that was both historically deep and socially inclusive. He produced a theatrical performance entitled The Star of Ethiopia, in which the leading actors were all women, portraying figures from ancient history. The starring role was that of Kandaka, Queen of the Ethiopians from the Christian New Testament. Kandaka stretches forth her hand here to direct the action, exercising her own power, not imploring someone else to exercise theirs on her behalf. In a survey text of African history published just 2 years later, Du Bois explained to readers that, according to the research of Egyptologists, Kandaka was not the name of a single Nubian queen, but instead a title given to multiple queens across Nubian history, who often reigned alone atop the political hierarchy. To accompany the Star of Ethiopia pageant, Du Bois then hired Bostonian sculptor Bedawark Fuller to craft a single piece embodying African Americans as a collective. For inspiration, Fuller came here to Boston's Museum of Fine Arts, where she spent hours touring the museum's collection of Egyptian art. The statue that Fuller ultimately produced to symbolize African American aspiration was that of an ancient Nubian woman, reanimated after a long slumber. Fuller entitled the piece Ethiopia Awakening, explaining that it was specifically meant to recall the power of Egypt's Nubian dynasty, the 25th dynasty. The following decades would then witness the rapid development of archaeological excavation in Nubia itself, thoroughly revolutionizing modern knowledge of the ancient past. The leading figure in that development was undoubtedly George Reisner, curator here at Boston's Museum of Fine Arts. Reisner excavated several of the most important archaeological sites in Sudan, greatly expanding the available evidence for feminine power in ancient Nubia. Many of these finds uncovered by Reisner's team are now on display here at the museum. The amulet that you see here on your left depicts a Nubian royal woman being suckled by a goddess, a conventional scene known also from Egyptian art, but one usually reserved for kings. One of the additional effects of Reisner's research was to demonstrate that feminine power had very deep roots in ancient Nubia. In a richly furnished burial at the site of Kerma from the 2nd millennium BC, he found the skull of a woman, still wearing her elaborate silver headdress. Now, Reisner's attitudes toward the subject of gender were somewhat complicated. He taught his own wife and daughter to read Egyptian, and he did advise and support at least 2 white female Egyptologists. But here at Kerma, it seems that his beliefs about race thoroughly disfigured his interpretation of feminine power, a process that scholars now call intersectionality. Reisner viewed the Nubians as racially distinct from and decidedly inferior to the Egyptians. So the power that he could envision for this ancient Nubian woman was nothing more than the power to degrade Egyptian culture. Reisner wrote of the burial, quote, "The positions of the female in primitive polygamous communities is easily misunderstood by modern Europeans. Her functions approach more nearly to those of an animal, and she clings with ignorant and uncomprehending obstinacy to the practices of her Neolithic ancestors." Ethiopia was no longer typecast as a suppliant woman reaching out for assistance. For Reisner, her outstretched hands were now somehow threatening. It was clearly not Reisner's intention to promote an ideal of Nubian queenship for posterity. But published work and museum collections have a way of taking on a life of their own. Reisner's archaeological research provided abundant evidence from which later generations could draw their own conclusions, including not just professional scholars, but also readers in the general public. By the middle of the 20th century, ancient Nubia was established as a symbol of feminine power. And the explosion of print culture and then digital media rapidly disseminated that idea to increasingly diverse global audiences. One of the most striking examples derives from very recent news. In April of 2019, this photograph went viral. It shows a young Sudanese woman named Ala Salah leading the protests for civilian governance in Sudan. Sudanese supporters quickly dubbed her Kandaka. The exact mechanisms of feminine power in Nubia are still a subject of much debate among professional scholars. But the ancient reality of that power is now indisputable. Moreover, as my brief survey today has attempted to demonstrate, Ethiopia stretching forth her hands has repeatedly inspired modern peoples around the world. For this reason alone, the intriguing case of the Nubian queen is certainly deserving of commemoration. Thank you.
So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and many thanks to the BMFA to invite me for this lecture. What I want to show in my lecture are basically 3 points. First, that settlement excavations in Nubia, in the Sudan, can teach us a lot about the normal life of the normal, ordinary people. And I will probably show you that Nubian or Emeritic settlement looked probably very different from what you would expect, and that accordingly life in such a settlement was apparently organized in a very urban way. Well, the setting. In the last or first millennium BC, that means in that time in which we play here, developed after the retreat of the Egyptians the Kushite kingdom to the south of Egypt, and it had two centers. Originally the one in Napata, near the Jebel Barkal, as you see in the upper photo, and parallel to it developed further south between the 5th and the 6th cataract another center, Meroe. The special thing about Meroe was it was, let's say, much more in the Iron Age. It was one of the largest, if not even the largest, production center of iron in northeastern Africa in that time. That means about the mid of the first century, first millennium BC, sorry. Towards the end of that millennium, it became then the political center of the kingdom. Herodot, for example, in the 5th century BC called this the capital of all other Ethiopians. Finally, in the 3rd century BC, the Royal Cemeteries were located in that area around Meroe, and from that time on, actually, the region around Meroe, let's say, simply boosted somehow. It developed a kind of what we call an urban landscape with many settlements along the Nile, with many temples and palaces, and also spread into the savannas, 4 kilometers into the savannas, like, for example, here in Naga, in the last picture you can see here. Well, from the early excavations in Nubia and the Sudan, you see here, for example, John Garstang's excavations between 1909 and 1914 in the Royal Cemetery of Meroe, and George Reisner's excavations in the Royal Pyramid Cemeteries of Meroe. We learned quite a lot about the temples, about the palaces, about the royal circumstances of life, about the chronology of that kingdom. But actually, what do we actually know about the normal life of the normal people? That means of those ones who built all these palaces and pyramids and so on. How their settlements looked like, and what kind of houses they were living. Were they living in straw houses or in round huts? Certainly not in palaces. What did they eat, for example? How their lifestyle was. Unfortunately, from these excavations, we didn't learn very much about that. Not very much, sorry. Well, okay, here our story starts, or begins. When John Garstang was excavating in Meroe in 1914, he, let's say, I don't know exactly how he did find them, but maybe it was a weekend holiday trip he made, very short distance, 2 miles to the south of the capital of Meroe. You see that on the right side. In a place called Hamadab, he found 2 stelae. 2 stelae carved, with text carved in ironstone. You see here one of his photographs. And they were located exactly, you see, at that place, in an island-like mound in the midst of the floodplain. Until today, these both stelae, which were excavated by him, bear indeed the longest known Meroitic inscription, which we have from the Sudan. Garstang excavated both stelae, transported the bigger one of them, it's a huge 2.5 meter high stela, to the British Museum, where it is now. The small stele is now in the Khartoum Museum, the National Museum in Khartoum. And Garstang also excavated a little temple behind that stele. Unfortunately, I must say, the stele didn't tell us very much about the normal life of the people, because we still don't understand the language. Well, But we can look to other things.
Louder, please.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Garstang was, as I already said, basically interested in securing or getting the stele. He excavated the temple. You see the temple itself, the central part of the temple, very normal, almost Egyptian-like layout of a small temple, but it's a bit unusual because it has a lot of lateral rooms which we couldn't interpret yet. On the entire mound which you see on the left side from you, no other structures have been visible, except that we have around a number of iron slag heaps, and it is completely scattered, or it was completely scattered, with potsherds and brick fragments. Well, that led to some speculations what kind of site that could have been. One of the more prominent speculation was, of course, that in fact this small temple was one of those temples which we know which are lining up sometimes the processional way of a larger temple, standing in front of the temples. Another speculation was, for example, that was kind of maybe summer residence of the royal house from the capital, which was basically 2 miles away. Well, when we started, and we means the Humboldt, in that time, Humboldt University of Berlin and the Shendi University and the Sudanese Antiquity Service, was a joint project. In 2001, work at the site, we actually didn't really believe these older hypotheses about the temple site and so on, especially because of the finding of the iron slag, for example, which doesn't fit to a temple site and which also doesn't fit to a summer residence of a royal house or something alike. And we were quite lucky, and so far as that we encountered the tops of the ancient walls already coming up to, how to say this in English, I'm not so very well in English, near to the surface, to the present surface of today. That means, with other words, when we took away about 5 to centimeters of dust, of soil, we would find in many places the ancient walls. So we decided, for that reason, not to make punctual, deep excavations, as normally an archaeologist is always dreaming of, because we said, okay, we may have the chance not to go, by not going into the depth, into the ground, but going into the surface to map the structures and to better understand them before we start excavating them and then understand their chronology. So we did. It took us, to get a complete what you see here in that area, it took us almost 10 seasons. And everything was mapped, I must say, also with, we made such kind of surface clearings which you see on the left side, and everything was mapped 1 to 20, so we were able to record every single brick, every charcoal piece, every potsherd, and so on. And what you see, what appeared was not a temple, it was a kind of settlement. This was we were looking for, and it is certainly not what you probably expected to be a normal settlement of that time. Since 2005, we used geophysics. First of all, magnetometry. That means you use a special device without excavating, you map the area by the magnetic anomalies. That gave us a larger picture of the whole mound and gave us also the complete extent, and you very clearly see also the enclosure wall of the settlement, but the structures themselves are not very clear. Later on, we had the chance to use ground-penetrating radar, and that was really surprising for us, and because they, as you see, show us a number of walls, especially in the lower parts of that area of that settlement, very clearly, every single wall. We also used other methods, for example, ERT on the left side and drillings, but they were not so effective. Well, combining that together, then you see what we found out, and this was for us absolutely surprising. Yeah? Till 2000, before we started, you see the mound was just known, the temple, and on the right side you see that the complete mound was a complete settlement, exactly what we hoped to find. If you shown, let's say, in a 3D, in a schematic 3D model, it looks like this. Just so that is the first stage after the excavation of John Garstang in 1909, after our first surface clearings, and now we have roughly that picture. And this is no fantasy, this is really based on the excavations. Well, let's have a closer look to it. What we have, and this is what we call the upper town, that's apparently a planned settlement. Its main features is, of course, a town wall, almost rectangular, a parallelogram of exactly 104 by 104 meters. That means exactly 200 by 200 cubits, Egyptian cubits. We have a central main street, which divides the whole settlement exactly in the middle. At the end of the main street, in the central place, you have the town temple. This is the one which was excavated by Garstang. It's quite for us also very interesting that you see the temple has not its own terminus. It's not divided from the other structures. It's really integrated into the town structures. It has a public forecourt. That forecourt is basically a plaza in front of the temple. This is the main street. And it has also, that we excavated in the last season, not a bigger public open space to the right of it. In the corner downstairs, in the corner here in the southeast, we have the administration of the town. And that, as you see already, has a clearly urban character. It is not a village. Yeah? It has not much space, for example, to have cattle or to have storages to store grain or other things. It is very densely crowded, and what is important from what we know also from the chronology shows us it is really an artificially made thing. It is a planned settlement, what we call in German a Planstadt. The whole thing is, we have in the north we have that settlement, and then we have kind of what we call the suburbs further in the south. So we can divide this. Apparently we have dense and regular urban structures in the enclosed settlement, which is apparently mostly domestic, with a sacral and administrative unit. And the suburbs in the south are not fortified, they are less rectangular, have more open spaces, and from what I will show you in some of the pictures later, you will see there was apparently also concentrated the workshop areas and, let's say, the kind of industrial area of that place. Well, it's clear that this, and this is also what it includes, let's say, that this settlement was housing a non-agrarian population. And that raises, of course, also some other interesting questions. For example, how these people were provided with food, with other things, which they not produce themselves. The people, by the way, we found them, let's say, and that was on another mount about half a kilometer away from the settlement here in the top. There is another larger mound, and I must say, we didn't find it ourselves. There have been grave robbers, and these grave robbers showed us, with other words, in 2005, that they are graves. So we made also geophysics there, magnetometry there, and found out that there must be something about 300 tombs, graves. They don't have a superstructure anymore, that's eroded. So it's in that way pretty safe. But interestingly, from the grave goods which have been found there, we really can say, first of all, It is a kind of middle-class society which was living there, and there are also various, which is, by the way, also typical for the Meroitic period, various funerary traditions. So we have, for example, stretched, and we have crouch positions of the skeletons. As you see, a lot of grave goods and so on. Well, starting in 2008, when we had enough funds, let's say, to make also deeper excavations, we were again surprised, because we were actually really so naive that we at the beginning believed that we have a one single period settlement. It would be a perfectly easy matter, that we have one construction period which gives us the settlement as it is. When we started excavating, we saw it's exactly the opposite. So we have a vertical chronology or stratigraphy of up to 4-5 meters. And the interesting point is also, which this schematic picture over there shows you, we have also a kind of horizontal stratigraphy, because it's a mound like a tell. That means that what we have in the center, on the highest point of the mound, are the youngest preserved remains of the settlement, and the more you go to the outside, the earlier you come, and you have then the earlier settlement periods there, let's say, documented. Well, and then the interesting point is also that we had the ability to take a lot of charcoal samples, more than 100 charcoal samples which have been dated. We took them basically from the streets and from other places, and we could build up such a chronology in 4 phases, and that's very interesting that these phases coincide also with these main phases of the Meroitic kingdom's history. So we have an early phase, 300, so that means parallel to the early Meroitic period, and so on, but I will show you some of them. Especially in this early phase, this is for us period D, this is the early Meroitic period. The so-called, what we call the upper town was not existing yet, but apparently here in the south must have developed a normal kind of village or so settlement. We didn't find it yet. What the evidence we have of that time are, you see these pots, large early Meroitic vessels, sometimes very nice ones, painted ones, which have been reused, turned upside down and reused as ovens for bread and kind of open-air bakeries. We cannot explain this yet, but we don't have further structures of that time, unfortunately. At about 100 BC, entering the classic Meroitic period, that upper town was planned and founded, and you see I grayed out what is later, and you see at the outside these structures are much more regular than in the center, so that's really planned. And let's say the first features which were built were certainly the enclosure wall and the main street, and basically the temple. You see then here the temple, which we then re-excavated. That whole area got at minimum of 4 reconstruction periods over the time of the whole settlement. These both stelae of Amanirenas, the one where, as I said, which is now in the British Museum, well datable, were set up in the probably third construction period. More interesting for us is the point, the Sacral Center, for example, how it was structured. It was interesting. You have a paved main street in front of the temple. You have plantation pits for trees, which were linked with irrigation channels. We have an altar in the front of the temple and also a public well in the main street. Well, the administration in the southeast of the settlement is the biggest house which we have there, very prominent, with so-called casemate foundations with vaulted storerooms. And if you reconstruct it, that was really astonishing. Our architect was able to reconstruct it, and it's probably a 4 to 5 story building, very much influenced by Ptolemaic architecture. Town gate also very Ptolemaic. For example, you could directly compare it somehow with Deir el-Medina, not so well preserved. And then in the later periods, what happens then with the settlement? In that time, state support decreases because the economical power of the kingdom goes down. Temple, so the state, the official buildings like temple and administration are finally abandoned, and the settlement spreads out again into the suburbs. From that period, interestingly, we were able to excavate a house. We could follow it through about 7 building periods. It's really the first Meritic house which was in detail excavated. And from these houses, for example, we have a lot of samples which tell us what the diet, the main diet of the people was. It was basically summer crops, different kinds of millets, dora, sorghum. We found cotton seeds, which show that cotton was really cultivated in that area. Mostly was used cattle, also sheep and goats. But there were also bones of wild animals, of Nile products, and we also analyzed the wood species, which told us, what's also very interestingly, that more than 90% of fuel which was used was Acheson nilotica, which is growing there. Well, our finds are not that nice, like from graves, from well-preserved graves, and not from royal graves, but they give us an idea of the lifestyle in that area, in such a settlement. Yeah, we have oil lamps, we have a little, this is a lid, decal of a lid box, different kinds of amulets and so on. And most important and most interesting for us at least is the pottery. We have several thousands of vessels, no, not several thousand vessels, but potsherds of several thousand of vessels. And that all was produced locally, also interesting. So we found the pottery kilns, 6 pottery kilns next to, centrally in that area. And finally also developed in the later period, I must say, iron production in that area, which was then kept up until the medieval period. So that means we have a settlement which is really self-sustained, if we can say this so. Well, okay, I think time is almost over. The future work of that excavations will be, of course, to make now the structural comparisons to other settlements, mostly in Egypt, Ptolemaic Egypt, but also to later Roman period and other settlements. And that is still a lot of work. But I hope I could show you that life in Meritic Nubia was, apart from the royal life, quite a very urban matter, which we know also from Hellenistic or Roman or Ptolemaic sources. And it is not so different, although we are at the edge of our civilization, let's say. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you to all our great speakers. I'd like to invite them to have a seat here, and now is your chance to ask them all of your saved-up questions. So, and thank you again for such illuminating programs and also for sticking to time.
Cool. They'll be ready in a minute.
I wonder why we're using different ones as opposed to just sharing. I'm afraid we're going to get interference with the mic.
I have two questions. Number one, about understanding the writing. One of you indicated that one didn't know how to interpret the writing. So can you give me the history of the writing when it's known at this particular point, whether you can understand it, you can read it? And the second question is, what about the present political situation? Was it very difficult to do excavation given the political situation? Okay, so
I would rather start with the first question. Okay. Why we don't understand Meroitic language? Actually, it's very it's not a matter of decipherment. Yeah. The writing itself is deciphered. But it is something what I usually compare when I read a Turkish newspaper. I can read it, but I don't understand the word. So, because that's not the matter of the deciphering of understanding the letters and their values, but it's rather understanding the lexic, the vocabulary of the language, the grammar of the language, and this work is not done yet, and this is not the job. The deciphering of a writing, a genius scholar can do if he's lucky, in 1 year. But like Champollion, for example, for the hieroglyphs. But it took until, and it still takes until today, the work of many, many Egyptologists, step by step, better and better to understand the language. And this is, for the Egyptian languages, the case. For the Meroitic language, we have another difficulty. And this is, we have about 1,200 texts, roughly, if not even more, unknown. And there is a very big group. These are the mortuary texts. And from these texts, you can understand quite a bit of the grammar, because they are repeating, and this is always the same formula. But they are playing, let's say, in a very limited sphere of life. So it doesn't give us much knowledge about different vocabulary and so on. And there are also known just a couple of, probably a dozen longer inscriptions. But without knowing the vocabulary, we have no chance to understand these longer inscriptions. And the second difficulty is we have, in fact, nothing to compare with. So it is difficult. Just in the last years, colleagues like Claude Rie from France, for example, he found out some other, how you would call them, languages, which are still today spoken in basically Eritrea, for example, where, according to his assumption, were quite near to the ancient Meroitic, because the ancient Meroitic itself is not spoken anymore anywhere. So, and that is a possibility to approach it, but this knowledge is very young, and as long as you did not have other languages to compare with, that was again very difficult for the understanding of the language. So these are basically the reasons.
I'd like to ask Dr. Pope, Hamadab is an urban settlement.
Can't hear you.
Hamadab is an urban settlement with a wall around it, and there's also an extramural settlement. So these people were not engaged in agriculture. Where were the sorghum and millets cultivated, and who controlled that cultivation? And was the administrative center in the southeast corner of the town, were grains redistributed from there to the population?
Okay, when I said these people were non-agrarian, that's first of all, of course, an assumption. We don't have it written. And secondly, I guess it is basically men. These people who were living in that settlement according to the structures in which they were living must have had a rather, as I said, urban lifestyle. That means there have been probably not that many farmers. But that does not mean that there were no people living in who worked, for example, as workers on the fields. I could imagine that, for example. So it is far too early to speculate about. There are, in fact, really speculations going so far that some people are convinced that in such settlements, maybe even the one of Hamadab, were craftsmen living who decorated the pyramids, for example. We can't say that so clearly, or so we don't have the clear evidence for that. So I guess there was living a mixture of people. There have been craftsmen, there have been probably workmen, there were living probably administrative people. Certainly the higher administration was somewhere in Meroe in the Royal House or in the Royal Centers. But the normal middle administration was probably also living, for example, these administrative guys, let's say so, administrators were living probably in this tower house, which we have there on the southeast. And the fields were certainly around. I didn't mention that here. In the last years, we made a big study about the landscape in that area, and it came out that, for example, in that area, basin cultivation is possible because of the landforms which we have there. And interestingly, the settlement of Hamadab is located in the middle of the floodplain, which is a bit unusual. Normally, you would build a settlement rather on the edge of the floodplain. But why it was exactly in the middle of the floodplain? And I could imagine that this settlement was built in order to house people directly on the spot. It means people who were working on the fields, and where they also organized the agrarian production. And it was a settlement which was in so far self-sustained that they had their own workshops for their tools and so on and so forth. So therefore, I guess the original foundation of the settlement and development of the settlement has something to do with agriculture, with providing Meroe, for example, with such things, or also with providing other settlements with fuel, which was also there. And by the history of the settlement, especially in the centuries AD, when the state control went down and state support went down, they developed more and more selbstständig, what is that? Yeah, self-sufficient, in order, and started probably also exchanging goods with other settlements and so on. How far it was controlled at the beginning we can't say, but I guess that at the beginning of that settlement it was indeed made by the government, also by the Royal House, and supported by the Royal House, which probably the Stele report, which we don't understand.
Yes, so I have a question here, and it builds on the question that the gentleman asked out here about the political situation and challenges. I'm also interested in just building on that and saying, how about the danger for those of us who might be interested in visiting that part of the world now, and your perspective on that?
Sure. Okay, so I guess I'll answer. So I've been excavating or doing survey in Sudan, like Pawel, for a big chunk of my career, so over 20 years now. And even when relations between the United States and Sudan have been extremely poor, the Antiquities Authority in Sudan has been extremely collegial and welcoming. And so they're very interested in foreign expeditions and even American expeditions. And across that 20 years, I've never run into a problem being an American. Now, of course, there's a caveat that goes with this, and that's that I've stuck to the Nile and particular parts of Sudan. So I would hesitate even now to go to Darfur, for example. or the border with Ethiopia, or the border with South Sudan. But the political situation has, by and large, not affected archaeology. I've never had a problem, getting permits to do things, even when you pass checkpoints and things like this, and I've never really been harassed at all by the police. They've always been very polite and professional, and somewhat interested in what we were doing. We always get a visit from the local security guys, and just to see what we're up to. And of course, we have a representative from the Antiquities Department with us, which is, and these people are not just inspectors like you have in Egypt, where they're kind of looking out primarily for the interests of the Egyptian government and the Antiquities Service or the Ministry of Antiquities there, but they're really colleagues. So they obviously do represent the Sudanese antiquities, but they also are really a part of your team. And in fact, our long-standing inspector, Hassan Mohammed Ahmed, actually got his PhD based on the data from and his work with us and our project. So those kind of collaborations are possible, which is really nice. And the current political situation, of course, it was volatile over the summer, but it seems to have stabilized in what we all hope is going to be a good trajectory towards a civilian government and improvements in human rights and so on. And so far, I'm planning, Kathryn's planning, to go out very shortly, and I'm planning on going out in January. And so far, everything seems to be running nicely. So, and the people in the north, I actually work in where the people are still speaking Nubian, and Nubian is their primary identity, and they're just incredibly nice people and welcoming. I've never had a problem with any of the local people. And the Sudanese I've encountered in general are all, have been really welcoming, really great to work with, very helpful, and so on. So I wouldn't hesitate, if you're going, you want to go with, a legitimate outfit, because there's still some logistical issues too, traveling around in Sudan, and you wouldn't want to go to those places I mentioned, but if you're going to see the sites that we've been talking about, then I wouldn't hesitate to go.
Hi, I have a question for Professor Howley, and this is talking about the lime importation of the lime and the shrubs used in the tiles. So, of course, the lower Egyptian Nile Valley has limestone all around it, but then you were suggesting that they were using shells from Wallace or something that they excavated. So have you been able to look at the isotopic signatures of those? Because it seems like a living animal, whatever isotope you got, even if it's not exactly precise to the century or whatnot, would be 100 million years different than the paleontological limestone on the walls of the valley. So have you looked into that, and what can you learn?
We're hoping so. Actually, it's a relatively new project. We've only been out for 2 seasons at this point, and I do seriously hope that we're going to be able to do some analysis of the faience material. There's some logistical issues surrounding that. We either have to get kind of the equipment into Sudan in order to do the analysis, something like a portable XRF machine. That, while probably not impossible, is very challenging in terms of getting the licenses we need to do that. Or we have to get the faience out of the country and bring it so that we can analyze it here, and that requires, again, it's possible, but it requires a slightly lengthy application process with the Sudanese Antiquities Service to get permission to bring that out. So I very much hope to do that at some point, and actually a similar kind of analysis has been done on Egyptian faience from the same time period, so we would have great data to be able to compare what we have with the locally made stuff at Sanam with what was being made in Egypt in the 25th and 26th dynasty. So I hope it would be very telling. Watch this space. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're going to end Q&A here, but I think all the speakers are looking out for a couple more minutes. If you want to come down and ask any questions of that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's really interesting.